Good afternoon, everybody. So, yeah, I said we'd do some more hangouts. This is sort of the first one. Unfortunately, Nathan couldn't make it. He had some last minute change of plans. So, I asked Dr. Dean and Bertram, my co host and partner in crime over on Untold Radio AM. And he's got one of my favorite doctorates of all time. We'll go ahead and bring him up. Hey, Dean.
Hey, it's good to be here. Thanks for asking me on.
Oh, no problem, man. Like I said, it's a hangout, so this is a lot more informal,
Cool.
if we need to. But yeah, I mean, so firstly, howdy to Bat Mom, who happens to be the first person in chat. And again, we'll take your questions again, more informal here. But so Dean, can you explain what your actual doctorate is in? Because this is my favorite thing in the world.
It's very nice of you to say. Well, I have a PhD in history from the history department of the University of Sydney, and my dissertation was on flying saucer culture and historical survey of American UFO belief. So I tried to situate UFO belief, which has changed as well. People tend to think it's
Mhm.
quite static. It's changed very much since the late 40s when I suppose the modern era started. And I tried to situate that within a cultural space, along with an historical space, along with the changing geography of America, because you can't understand much of modern UFO belief, like things like Roswell and Area 51 and Hangar 18, all these secret
Mhm.
spaces, unless you understand that that type of idea was only made capable by the secret bases which are legitimate in the national security state of post World War II. Like before, it didn't make any sense to have talked about things like that, but
Yeah.
whether it's true or not, it all of a sudden started making sense. So anyway, I just tried to situate these beliefs, whether
Mhm.
they're real or not. I don't have the power to decode as a although I have my suspicions. I don't think a lot of it's based on extraterrestrials visiting, but I certainly, as a historian and a cultural historian, I have the ability, I hope, to situate those beliefs in broader cultural strands, and that's pretty much what I did.
And that's one of my favorite things about what you do, and a lot of the conversations we have on Untold Radio is that aspect of it because it's often very much overlooked in the conversations that we see in popular media. So we'll definitely be getting into that. Again, we're live every Tuesday. We have a lot of fun over there.
Oh
It's
yeah,
gonna be
that's
great.
great.
And Dean has um, very graciously agreed to come and do some interviews with me over on Sirupapers. We're working on that. Like I said, it's going to be a little bit more structured. We won't be doing live things. It's going to be trying to answer specific questions, and Dean's been good enough to sort of be my UFO expert on this, so it's going to be fun. Lots of fun coming up. Susan Robertson, howdy. And oh, you found a good church. Yes, excellent. I'm glad to hear that. Donnie Cho is in the house as well, causing trouble as always. We'll get him on here one of these hangouts as well. Um so let me just go ahead and again, guys, if y'all have any questions for Dean or me or just in general, feel free to shoot them out there. So Dean, I think this is probably my favorite thing that you taught me because this is one of those things where there's weird overlap. Like there's things I already knew, things I didn't, but I never put this together, and you did, and I love it, which is how all these modern UFO beliefs and thoughts have their predecessors. Hey, cheese freak ginger snap, best name on the internet, and I'll fight anybody over that one. Um, but all these modern UFO beliefs and interpretations, even ancient astronaut theory, basically all have predecessors in. I mean, even relatively recent belief, like Atlantis, all I cannot remember Blavatsky, all that. Like it goes back a ways. Can you talk about that for just a second? Like just some thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, when we talk about ancient astronaut theory, or it's more popularly perhaps today because of the show Ancient Aliens, called Ancient Alien Theory. But we tend to think of it emanating from the writings of Eric von Daniken in the late
Hmm.
60s and up to today. I mean, he's written so many books. But
Yep.
von Daniken was writing in a space that already existed, this new age space, which was already talking about ancient civilizations which predated ours, which were more technologically advanced. And you're right, that appears in the beliefs of theosophy, mainly the books written by Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, but it continued on after that. It appears in the writings of fiction from the early 20th century, like H.P. Lovecraft would be a good
Hmm.
example. Charles Fort, who's perhaps the granddaddy of UFO belief and the I mean, one of his biographies, I think, is called referred to as the father of the supernatural, or the man who invented the supernatural, or something, which is a little bit of an exaggeration, but certainly his writings were very influential, and he seemed to think that people might be property on this planet of an extraterrestrial species. Now, whether Fort was serious or not, he certainly threw that idea out. It's often hard to tell whether Charles Fort had his tongue firmly planted in his cheek or not, but the ideas existed prior
Yeah.
to the modern UFO area. And you're right, perhaps the most important recent, when I say recent, I mean the last couple hundred years, strain of that thought is in the writings of Ignatius Donnelly, who wrote a book called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And he
Yeah.
took Plato's description, which is obviously thousands of years before Donnelly was writing. He took Plato's description of this mythical advanced civilization, which supposedly had collapsed 9,000 years even before Plato was writing. So you can't even
Mhm.
say an ancient Greek or an ancient Mediterranean civilization. It's an ancient Mediterranean
Yeah.
civilization. It was ancient even then. And most people tended to place that because of Plato's description somewhere outside the Straits of Gibraltar. And,
Yeah.
that this island had sunk. But what Donnelly had took from that story, which he took literally, most people hadn't taken that story literally for thousands of years, but Donnelly
Right.
literally. And his point was that when Atlantis sunk, either people escaped or had already formed colonies all around the world. So most of the cultures that we know as ancient or old cultures
Mhm.
actually had a root source from Atlantis. So whether that was, the Greeks, or whether that was the Sumerians, or whether that was the Aztecs, or all around the world, he found similar supposedly structures or similar languages which indicated that there was an ancient pre-diluvial civilization before.
Mhm.
And so you tend to have that becoming very popular in the late 19th, early 20th century, and that's what goes on to, I suppose, infect, or the mind
Mhm.
spreads into theosophy in places like that from
Yeah.
Donnelly originally, and then via Blavatsky into the New Age, and then by the 1960s, it's fairly solidly formed before von Daniken even picks up a pen. So the book The Morning of the Magicians by two Frenchmen, Berger and Powell, had made
Mhm.
that idea already popular in their book, again, The Morning of the Magicians. And it had again appeared in fiction writing of people like H.P. Lovecraft, the idea of these ancient civilizations. And so by that stage, it's starting to become potentially extraterrestrial. Donnelly was never suggesting
Mhm.
the ancient Atlanteans were ETs. They were just humans who had a very advanced ancient culture. But by
Yeah.
by the time that Eric von Daniken starts writing his book in the
Mhm.
60s, it had already been floated by, again, in fiction, also in early UFO writers. So George Adamski, who's the most famous UFO contactee of the 50s, in other words, people who were supposedly communicating with these beautiful, benevolent space brothers visiting the planet in flying saucers, had the first half of his first book was written by somebody else, Desmond Leslie, and the first half of Adamski's original book essentially posited Eric von Daniken theory, almost 15, 16, 17 years earlier. So it was
Mhm.
already in the UFO belief system that there were ancient ET civilizations on the planet. And so when von Daniken picks up the pen and writes it, it just hits the cultural zeitgeist at the right time, or becomes the zeitgeist, I guess. And so
Yeah.
it's from that book that not everybody might have had a copy in the 1950s of a George Adamski book, Desmond Leslie book on their shelf. But
Mhm.
I know growing up in the 70s, you almost couldn't go to somebody's house and look at their bookshelf and not see a copy of Chariots of the Gods. It was
Yeah.
everywhere in my youth anyway.
No, you're absolutely right. My dad had a copy, and yeah, it was definitely really, really big and popular. And of course, we've talked about the pulp fictions from the 40s, right? The Shaver mysteries. I
Mhm.
didn't like I was aware of pulps, obviously, in the sci-fi pulps. I had no idea about the Shaver mysteries per se before you brought them up. And essentially, it's the same repetition of theme that of all these things, except now we're introduced to UFOs and flying saucers, and as part of, again, a very terrestrial, but they went, as I recall, part of his stories, they went into space, and so it's like they weren't necessarily extraterrestrial, they were just ultra terrestrials in a way.
Right, yeah, the
Mhm.
creatures left on Earth in the Shaver mystery are subterranean because supposedly they had to flee underground because the sun's rays were gradually poisoning everybody. But you're right, a lot of them supposedly fled to space again in antediluvial times, and there were also in some of the stories other space races as well. So there was a rich Star Trek-like cosmos established by
Mhm,
Richard Shaver and Ray Palmer in the 1940s. Before the first flying saucers, or at least the concept of
mhm,
flying saucers, was seen in American skies. This happened 3 years before it started 3 years before Kenneth Arnold had the first flying saucer sighting, where the term was
mhm.
actually coined, flying saucers. It was already out there again in the zeitgeist that there were advanced spaceships coming and going from the planet, and they were related to a very ancient, you're right, terrestrial culture that existed pre the flood.
Yeah. Hey Lisa, I'm glad to see everyone who's on. And again, if you're watching this on replay, we love you too. Our love is not reserved strictly for those who are live. Um, so again, it seems like this UFO ancient astronaut theory idea, everyone thinks of it as being this new organic thing. It seems like it's a very old concept in a lot of ways, and it's pulling from a lot of these older thoughts. Here's my question. Even the term like flying saucer, which again is not really what he was describing physically, he was describing the motion of like uh something like he called it like a saucer bouncing, like a disc bouncing along the water is how it was moving. Because what he described is very much like a flying wing, like a crescent shaped flying wing. Um which begs a lot of, which honestly for me has started begging a lot of questions, because I think, like me, you agree there is a there's definitely a phenomena out there. You, like me, just don't believe that the phenomena is aliens, right? You think there is a
Correct.
spiritual component,
Mhm.
but then the question becomes how much is how big a slice of the government is this whole UFO thing, right?
Mhm.
Is sort of, I think that's sort of the question we both have. If you'd asked me even a year ago, I would have said, definitely a big piece, but definitely not, you know, uh, all of it. Um, and oh, hold on, we got a great question here from Lisa Smith. Um, does anyone know what is painless to eat with a stomach ulcer? Honestly, outside of milk and I don't. I mean, that's yeah. I'm surrounded that. Hold on. This might be one for the wife. Let me try something here. So again, anyone who's got any suggestions for Lisa, throw it in there and give me one second. Let me yell at.
Yeah, I think probably the milk's the best thing I can think of as well. Do they have an over the counter medicine for stomach ulcers in America? I'm sure you would have looked into that though, Lisa, if there was. And obviously you want to eat something and not just take medications. So
See, this when I need something important, I ask my wife, and she's gonna just look it up for any suggestions. But yeah, I mean, to Dean's point, I know that they do make medications for that. Um, I know it can be a lot of pain. Um, oh, Korea, here we go, Donnie. Rice porridge for stomach problems, but yeah, there you go. Again, I don't really have a lot of connections with ulcers. I'm sorry, Lisa, but we'll see if we can get a list for you together. This is the power of the community. Donnie's still waiting for the TIE fighter shaped UFOs. You know,
I bet you somebody's seen one somewhere. I bet if you went over the whole records of UFO belief, I bet you sometime when flying saucers
okay.
rather when Star Wars became enormous, I bet you somebody
Oh,
reported one in the
exactly.
70s.
So funny thing, I have, no matter how big of a geek I am, I've always hated the TIE fighters. However, do love TIE interceptors. The ones where they have the more diamond shaped wings coming, or they're technically heat dispersal or heat dispersing panels, I think.
Huh.
Yeah, and yeah, I know these things. Anyway, that was always my favorite one. But again, like if you'd asked me even a year ago, I would have said, yeah, a lot of these things are, the government is definitely using it to, is using the phenomena. It's manipulating. I think now going through a lot of this stuff, because again, no one can know everything, and you specialized in this. Going through a lot of this with you has made me realize that it just seems like the government probably has a much larger hand in the entire thing, even manipulating the movement overall very deliberately. I mean, honestly, it's starting to make me wonder how much of the entire um, phenomena is legitimate, right? Because yes, there's a supernatural component to it. Again, you know, hundreds of cases of people being tormented by, again, aliens at night, and yet traditional Christian exorcism techniques end it. Sometimes these things are ended immediately. There's a lot of again, there's clear parallels to stuff that's gone on with the Fae and all this other stuff for centuries, right? This is not a new phenomena, but that when we take the actual sort of abduction stuff out of it and a few of the genuinely weird sort of orb things, it really starts to wonder, like, what about the rest of it? Like, is it all deliberate manipulation by the government to push this theory? How much of the UFO phenomena is being pushed by, or the UFO researchers are being manipulated by the government very deliberately?
Yeah, I think considerably. It's probably worth noting as well that I mean, it's so obvious it almost doesn't even need saying, but it's worth saying is that UFO belief and the flying saucer phenomenon as we understand it really develops in post World War II America and in the Cold War when so, put the psychological reasons why it might be potent to see something weird in the skies and have a different significance to what it did pre-World War II. It
Mhm.
also means that the government were legitimately testing all types of
Oh,
aircraft. We
yeah.
were we were we were going in leaps and bounds in aerial technology
Mhm.
during the Cold War. We got a bunch of Nazi scientists who had all kinds of their own, tech, which we were probably playing around with. We were in an economic and a military and a militaristic and a Cold War with the Soviet Union. So we were just pumping out this
Yeah.
stuff. And we know that one of the clearest and in some ways less conspiratorial facts about government disinfo is we
Mhm.
know that the CIA were happy to manipulate or to encourage UFO
Mhm.
belief to cover up sightings of things like U-2 spy planes which were being seen. In fact,
Yep.
a historian who worked for the CIA wrote an official paper saying that we estimated something like 60+% of sightings of flying saucers in American skies back in those days was our
Mhm.
technology being tested. So that's pretty telling in itself. And that doesn't even require a more elaborate conspiracy, which I'm
Yeah.
obviously happy to talk about those theories as well. Just the idea that there was one part of the US government, and don't forget it's very compartmentalized intelligence agencies and military, intelligence agencies and civilian intelligence
Mhm.
agencies and everything else. We know there was at least one intelligence arm that was happy to spin this stuff as flying saucers because it helped
Yeah.
cover up, what was actually being seen. So that in
Mhm.
itself, I think, is a good jumping off point for any researcher who wants to start looking at this stuff. People often use the Robertson panel as a jumping off point, which was, again, a CIA type of study which suggested that you had to be careful with the way that flying saucers were perceived because it could be
Mhm.
used by the Russians or it could spark off social panic and all these other things. People usually take that in the UFO community to mean there was some bigger disinfo game being played, and maybe there was, but a lot of that again is Cold War specific concerns about what people might react to when they see something in the sky. So a lot of this conspiratorial stuff makes a lot of sense without having to go down an X-Files type, conspiracy
Right.
rabbit hole.
Cheese Freak so firstly, hi Gene. Cheese Freak has a great question though, and I think this is sort of the whole point. One of the points, starting off points of this conversation. I thought it'd be great to have you on. Um, she asks, "Do you think they could be from other planes of existence?" And I think that's sort of what we just said, right? It's like there is a real phenomena occurring, right? But that the problem is the government is absolutely using that phenomena to initially hide their experimental aircraft and stuff, but that more recently they may have other agendas. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I think it's more complicated than they're just that it is another phenomenon from another plane of existence because some of it, as Jason said, could very likely be one of the most important things I think to keep at the front of your mind whenever you're looking at a UFO report, or whether you're looking at the history of UFO sightings or UFO belief or anything else, is a lot of people who believe, or a lot of people who don't believe in UFOs, tend to want to put them all into one bucket. So people who believe they're from, I don't know, the Zeta Reticular star system want to believe they're all from the Zeta Reticular star system, and maybe the government got a crash saucer in Roswell in 47 and back engineered, but it's all kind of extraterrestrial. And then there are other people who might want to say it's not extraterrestrial, it's actually demons. It's all demons. Okay. And there's other people who might want to use something like a planes of existence type thing, or they're an energy like John Keel suggested, or that they have similarities to the Fae, and to fairy lore like Jacques Vallée suggested. But it mightn't be just one of those things. It might be several of those things. And I'm not saying that means there's demons and fairies and everything else, but maybe some of the sightings are what the questioner said were other planes of existence. Just use that as a throwaway meaning. That could it be another spiritual force, or could it be perhaps almost another science fiction force, but not from another planet, from another dimension, which is something people are quite popular to talk
Mhm.
about. Sure, I think some of it could be. And I think to look at the mystery, we have to go, okay, that was the planet Venus misidentified by somebody. Okay, that was a U-2 spy plane misidentified. Okay, that was a new black triangle air program, Air Force program where they're testing these kind of crafts. Okay, that was just swamp gas. Okay, that
Right.
was a hoaxer doing that. But somewhere in that all of that noise, there might be a signal of a genuine anomalous phenomenon. And I think that's what we're probably talking about when we're saying, are they from other planes of existence? I think something is
Mhm.
beyond the obvious, more mundane explanations. And I don't think there are extraterrestrials visiting at all. Not because, and I could be wrong, but because I think that's taking the phenomenon at a face value, which is kind of dangerous, because whatever this is, when people have a genuine encounter, not just see a light in the distance, but when they see a little figure beside their
Mhm.
bed, which also could be sleep paralysis, by the way. But let's say you're driving along at night and you see something in a field and you stop, and there are weird little men running around. Now, just because those weird little men then jump in something that looks like a silver spaceship and take off, you're making a lot of assumptions to assume that that spaceship's from Zeta Reticula. You're making a lot of assumptions that this phenomenon is telling you the truth. One quick analogy that I like to use is, if you're a little kid and you're playing in your front yard and this van, let's say a creeper van, because we're adults, we know what that means. A creeper van pulls up and the driver leans out and he's dressed as a clown and says, "Hey kids, I'm Funbo the Clown and I'm going to Disneyland and I've got puppies and kitties and candy in the back. Jump on in, it's going to be a party." Now, if you took that Funbo the Clown as a legitimate clown, and that you thought he actually was going to Disneyland, you were going to have a fun party as a kid, that would be a horrible mistake to make. And as
Yeah.
adults, we know not to necessarily believe somebody who has that ridiculous acclaim. But people in the UFO community, both experiencers and a lot of people who are just interested in it and believe, have no problem with taking at face value something that an entity they have no idea its real origins, what it tells them its origins are. So they're like little kids who believe Funbo the Clown and jump in the creeper van. They jump on
Yeah.
board. I mean, it's foolish as an adult to make that. It's deadly as a child to make that mistake, and maybe as an
Yeah.
adult, sometimes it's deadly as well. There's certainly stories of injuries and deaths and disappearances and all kinds of things in when we look at some of this. So yeah, I'm very wary of assuming the phenomenon is what it tells me it is.
Well, again, aside from, what I mentioned earlier about the fact that we have hundreds of accounts of things that don't line up with the non-government. I want to kind of stay away from the governmental aspect of this for just a moment. I want to put a little pin in that and just on what is clearly the anomalous phenomena, right? Again, we have hundreds of accounts of people where, again, Christian exorcisms ends the phenomena in its tracks. I've had personal accounts with this, with people I've helped. Like there's too much, and then when you get beyond just those aspects, there's a lot of this other material out there. It's just, again, it's all very publicly acknowledged. Where you're like, hey, this just feels weird, right? Like why do we have these connections between this and UFOs, or creatures, or they're supposed to be from another planet, or again, planet or plane of existence. Here's the thing: it's saying that, if the concept is they are naturally existing organic creatures from another world. It doesn't matter if it's a plane of existence or another planet; they're still extraterrestrials, right? Fundamentally. So it's like it's a distinction without a difference, and as far at least in my opinion on in that regard. Um, but I don't like when I have when there's all this other overlap with shadow people, right? People who have been abducted. There's a often report shadow instances of shadow people. Again, something I'm very familiar with. Um, the number of people who end up being abducted, that again, the ones who've had been or had contact with extraterrestrials in a lot of sense, the ones that we know about, there seems to be an awful high occurrence of them having occultism in their own background or in their family's background as children. I think it's like 2 years ago now. Um, I was on Daniela's show, and she brought on perfectly nice woman, um, who's a Christian now, but she grew up, her mother was deeply into the occult, and she talked about a time when a creature in a dark robe, which again is something, dark robes are something that pops up that extraterrestrials wear an awful lot, right? Which again seems really odd to me, but it came in, and she said this thing had the face of an owl. It wasn't just a man in an owl mask; it had the face of an owl. But her mother and grandmother had been deep into the occult. These are themes that just don't seem to line up if the truly anomalous phenomena are simply creatures, again, from Zeta Reticuli or Clendathu or whatever, you know, um, just coming here because they want it on a beer run, right? It just there's I don't like again, everything's pie, preferably pumpkin. I like pie charts, and I like Venn diagrams, and uh, when there is a when there's a this much overlap, it tells me that there's just nothing going, that there's something else happening here.
I think that's insightful, and I think that there's lots of reasons beyond just an abductee's experience who might have had an occult background or also has paranormal experiences. There
Mhm,
is a consistent pattern within people who even have sightings of things. And often ufologists don't ask the right question, just like a cryptozoologist might not ask the right question, just like a ghost hunter might not ask the right question. So if you're a UFO investigator and you
mhm,
go to a site where somebody saw little men outside of a craft or said there was an ET in their bedroom, your average nuts and bolts extraterrestrial hypothesis ufologist doesn't ask the follow-up question, have you ever had any other paranormal experiences?
yeah,
Same way as a cryptozoologist who believes Bigfoot's a flesh and blood animal roaming the woods isn't
mhm,
normally going to ask that witness, have you ever seen a UFO or have you had any other paranormal experiences? But when you ask witnesses those questions, this is something John Keel realized very early on back in like the 60s or 70s. When you ask witnesses those questions, they often aren't an experience just of a UFO or an experience just of a Bigfoot. Sometimes those things might appear in the same space. Somebody might see a UFO
mhm,
land and then see a Bigfoot. But often the person who saw the UFO land and saw little men get out also has had poltergeist activity in their home, for example.
mhm,
And another insight which originally I think comes from Keel is the idea of window areas. So
mhm,
today we probably are most commonly or are most aware of those by shows like Skinwalker Ranch or UFO Witness that went out to Marley Woods, where they have another Skinwalker Ranch type location where it's not just UFOs that are seen, it's weird cryptids and there's poltergeist activity and there's all these kind of things. So those type of window areas also beg the question, if all of this is different phenomena, if UFOs are just extraterrestrial
mhm,
spacecraft, why are they also showing up regularly in an area which seems for all intents and purposes to be haunted by all kinds of weird and strange and out there things? So it would seem to be that there's a connection between these various phenomena, which makes me think that there's a root phenomenon at the heart of it. And my suspicion is, and again, I've no way of proving this, but that all of those things are just a manifestation of that root phenomenon. And
mhm,
that could be a root phenomenon like demons legitimately putting on different, I guess, masks for a very simple term to trick
mhm,
people. Or it could be some type of Keelian energy that just manifests the way we expect it to. But whatever your take is, I think when you look into the type of comparisons you were talking about people who've been abducted and an exorcism ritual will stop it, or people calling out the name of Jesus in the middle of it will stop it. And when you look at people who have a history of being raised in an occult family, also had an interest in the occult, for example, Albert K. Bender, the man who
Mhm.
had the first real Man in Black experience,
Yeah.
which was made famous in Grey Bark as they knew too much about flying saucers. Bender ran a flying saucer club, but he also was seriously into horror movies. His whole room was covered in
Mhm.
occult symbolism. He was somebody who mixed in those kind of darker spaces anyway. So the Men in Black iconography, if for a moment we step back now, we think of it as Will Smith because it's being, so Hollywoodized, or even if we don't think of it as that, we tend to
Mhm.
think of it as shady X-Files type agents. But if you go back to the start of that, it seems more like a demonic manifestation because Bender's fooling around in that kind of
Mhm.
space anyway. So is it if you'd first heard about a Men in Black and it wasn't attached to an extraterrestrial story,
Yeah.
the obvious conclusion would be this thing seems kind of evil. Men in black suits appearing up at my house in the middle of the night and threatening me, or what? I mean,
Mhm.
acting all weird. It's only that we've attached them to flying saucer belief, that there's an assumption that somehow it must have to do with ET visitation. But it's
Yeah.
that also is part of a much older tradition of strange figures in black bothering and haunting people and disturbing them and knocking on their doors or
Oh,
appearing in their
exactly.
bedroom.
Yeah,
So
exactly. Yeah, that's one of those things that I love how Ancient Aliens, people sit there and say, "Well, the Men in Black phenomena goes back for centuries." And it's like, okay, stop right there. Stop. If your theory is that Men in Black are government agents, are you telling me the King of England, right, was sending out people in the Middle Ages in black cloaks? You know, it's like it does seem like there's a lack of contextualization for a lot of this material. It's like we can only look here, and then it's like we'll look to these things in the past, but we won't ask any questions about it. Just like, see, this is an old phenomenon. Boom, we're done. Well, hold on there, right? And was it Bender himself? I was trying to remember. Was it Bender? There was one of the researchers into the Men in Black very, very early. He dropped everything, but he said this man in black hovered through the wall into his room. I can't remember if it
yeah,
was.
that Bender eventually, I think, shut down his club and said
Mhm.
he had nothing to do with it. He did write one book after Barker's, which Barker might even have helped him publish, and that was, I think, called Flying Saucers and the Three Men. I don't have a copy anymore. I used to. I
Yeah,
need to get another copy of that book. But that was Bender essentially telling his whole story. And in his story, they ended up being weird extraterrestrials, but there was certainly paranormal phenomena attached to it that we don't
yeah,
attach to the idea of a secretive government agent coming to
yeah,
silence people because they saw something they shouldn't have seen.
yeah. Hey, Judy, welcome, welcome, welcome. Yeah, I mean, this is John Keel. I mean, that's the thing is that you see a lot of these early ufologists. They all seem to come to Jacques Vallée. They all seem to come to this idea. It's like, hey, these things are not what they claim to be. Like that's the main point. Is they aren't what they claim to be, and that's the problem. Whatever they aren't presenting themselves as they are to us. They are putting on a veneer, and this is one of those things why a Bible? Well, it's like this is a Bible study channel. Why are we even talking about this? Well, again, talking to the guy who wrote how Bigfoot and UFOs prove the Bible is true. That's the entire point here. This is my theory, my hypothesis for this is, hey, this is the next big lie, right? This is, whether the government start off with the whole UFO thing just to cover up their experimentation with captured Nazi science and experimental aircraft and Japanese scientists and experimental aircraft. By the way, it wasn't just again because there was a different project for the Japanese citizens as well. It wasn't just Operation Paperclip. I can never remember the one um, for Japanese scientists, but we brought them all together and it's like, here, make us the most super cool technology ever, and they did. And it gets, you know, it's like, sure, the government probably had benign, or at least more materialistic reasons for wanting to use ufology as a disinformation portal to cover their tracks, right? Granted, right there with you. However, has it been manipulated further to have alternative, uh, intentions? Yeah, I think it has. And I do think that, again, ancient astronaut theory is going to end up being that one world religion. I don't think we've seen the final permutation of it, but I think that fundamentally these are the building blocks for this eventual, one world religion that's going to be pushed onto us. Um, oh, hold on. Because y'all have got some great questions. I want to throw them up here, but not specifically Unit 731, but yeah, 731 is a part of it. But that was their stuff on biological and chemical experiments. Which, by the way, y'all want to 731 was every bit as brutal and inhumane as the Nazis ever wanted to be. But no, they actually had their own. Again, they took a lot of their aeronautics experts as well, because the Japanese were working on some really interesting technology as well. So they brought them over as well, just the same way we had Operation Paperclip. We had a version of Paperclip for Japanese scientists, and we probably got a lot from Unit 731 also. Yeah, it was, again, 731. They did some terrible things. But the point being, this is where this overlap happens, because in a lot of ways, I think that the modern UFO phenomena is that veneer, right? That's going to allow, because it's going to allow for actual demonic entities to walk the earth and not cause any alarm, right? I mean, because this is sort of that big problem. Everyone's like, well, how in the world are people not going to recognize what's going on around them, during this time period? Well, they have to have some kind of a veneer. There has to be some sort of a cover. And this just feels so much like the cover for this phenomenon, given particularly the last few years, the entire UFO phenomena or movement has been towards the paranormal and new age philosophy.
Yeah, I think you definitely have a point. I'm not sure what the what the UFO end game is, whether it's,
Mhm.
whether it's being manipulated by the government or by bigger forces. But I do agree with you that I suspect there's going to be some type of way this is used by, I guess, sinister forces, for lack of a better term. Could that be
Mhm.
used in the sense that that it works towards a one world government, i.e., as some people have suggested, oh, there's an
Mhm.
extraterrestrial threat. This is what even stuff Reagan was talking about right back in the
Yeah.
day. Certainly
Mhm.
played in a number of science fiction movies. That you present an ET presence to help unify the world or to get some social policy instituted on the planet. I think that I guarantee that's been war gamed. I guarantee people have sat around at places like, I don't know, we won't name any names, but at genuine think tank, particularly ones which were involved with intelligence and military. I guarantee people have sat around, especially if the president was talking about it back in the 80s,
Mhm.
there were people talking about it behind the scenes. And in fact, there's a book which might be a hoax called Report from Iron Mountain, where which is essentially about how do we keep continuity of government, at a
Right.
time of crisis or something. But one of
Mhm.
the throwaway lines in that is, "Oh, we could do this, ET thing."
Yeah.
So I'm sure people have war gamed it. So it's definitely out there. I bet you it's in the cards. You know what I mean? I bet you it's one of the cards that people have
Yeah.
thought about. We could play this. Is there going to be, as you suggested, that used as a kind of as an explanation why there are things which don't look human walking among us? Possibly. I mean, I believe that the end times probably aren't that far away. I believe that there will
Mhm.
be all kinds of weird supernaturalism, and that would certainly be a way of having people who are essentially with an atheistic or just a new age view go, "Oh, okay, that makes sense." So it definitely makes sense. I'm never sure how any of this stuff's gonna play out. I know it's gonna play out somehow.
Right.
I'm just not sure how.
Well, exactly. So, real quick, for Lisa, my wife found a thing that might help you with your stomach ulcer issue. I put it in the chat. However, it broke up into two, so I went and grabbed another one. So, Dean, you can ignore the thing I just pinged you. That was
Gotcha.
just me trying to
I
share
was
the
just
link.
checking it now. Gotcha.
Yeah, my wife's texted it to me, so I'm like, well, I can't text it to the thing. Anyway, so yeah, it's the third one down, where it's the much shorter one. So Lisa, I hope that's useful. Yeah, and to your point about how will it all play out, I don't know exactly how it's going to play out either, but I think it's wise to stop and say, okay, well, hold on, what are they setting up? Because he was even von Braun himself, to again, this is what his nurse alleges, that on his essentially on his deathbed, he told her, hey, they're going to use UFOs as a as sort of the excuse to do a lot of things. Like that's going to be the excuse, are UFOs. And it's, you know, it's not too hard to imagine that being the thing. And again, the whole Venn diagram thing. Why do we see such a connection between the occult and high technology, as well in the occult and and UFOs, right? Again, not just in abductees, but even modern UFO thought. We just did the MUFON video, right? A couple weeks ago, where
Mhm.
again, this is MUFON. Traditionally, MUFON, when they got reports with high elements of high strangeness, they ignored it or they edited out of the account. And yet, in this documentary they put out, it's all very nuts and bolts until the last 30 minutes, where things got really weird really fast. And you're like, whoa, 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 whoa. This isn't the MUFON I'm familiar with. And so it just feels like, again, are we going to see like ET walking around the street? No, but I do think it's going to be you. Again, one of the theories I have is let's commune with our space brethren. Here's some DMT, right? And it's like, well, you know, they can't really exist in our world, and or you know, it's like here we can do, because even oh, dang it, what's his name? I'm terrible with names. Y'all know that.
Terence McKenna, who was
No,
part
no,
of
no. Sorry, sorry. I was going further back. He called himself the
Timothy.
Beast
Oh, Aleister
666.
Crowley.
Aleister Crowley. Thank you. And now I can hear the song. You know, he talked about Lamb. He called him a demon. Again, I have him in several of my books where he mentions, you know, today we call them angels and demons. Tomorrow we'll call them something else. The people who carried on his religious thoughts, they claim very highly that that Lamb was actually a telepathic alien from a race of telepathic aliens, and that they still communicate with Lamb to this day. So it seems like everyone went from, you know, there's this through line. Even the very famous 1947 FBI paper, right, that everyone likes to point to, where it's like it happens right about the same time as Roswell, and they're talking about how, oh, UFOs are remote controlled craft from another plane of existence, right? At the very bottom it says this information was obtained through supernatural means, right? It's like, okay, what is the FBI doing with supernatural? You know, what do you mean by supernatural means, right? And why is the FBI using it? Why do Ouija boards have anything to do with contacting Mork from Ork, right? If these things were just nuts and bolts things, I'm sorry, but your Ouija board should not be contacting Mr. Spock.
Mhm.
But if Mr. Spock ain't actually Mr. Spock, and it is all, you know, again, everyone who's been on the channel for a long time knows demons are the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim, that there's higher orders of magnitude. But the point is, just demonic is, you know, just that side of the veil and evil. But if these things are demonic, then, or satanic, however you want to say it, then it makes a lot more sense. Again, Occam's razor, the least amount of assumptions tends to be the right answer. And I find, again, Venn diagram, you know, it's like, why do we have all this occult connection in the UFO world? It just seems like, okay, maybe we don't have guys in little silver suits with big heads walking around, but maybe it's to make you more familiar with, you know, using what we would consider occult techniques to contact spiritual beings. And it's like, oh, well, just we're telepathic now, right? It's telepathic, or we're just, you know, it's this integration of a lot of these traditionally occult and shamanistic practices into extraterrestrials. Again, I quote this all the time. C.S. Lewis, he postulates in Screwtape Letters the existence of the materialist witch, that would essentially, again, this is a paraphrase, he would allow you to believe in things supernatural without believing in the supernatural. That's exactly what the modern UFO movement seems to be. It's it takes all this stuff from the deep occult, from the occult from the past anyway, right? Like we were just discussing. It repurposes it and reshapes it into, um, the 21st century. It's like, okay, we've all seen Star Trek, so we all know what this can be, and we're just gonna throw all this stuff in there and just use whiz bang Star Trek language, like, oh, they're not they're not angels and demons from the spiritual world. They're energy beings from an alternate dimension, right? From another plane of existence. It's like, well, I'm sorry, what's the difference? Throwing Star Trek language on it doesn't make it not what it is, right? Real quick, y'all have got some great questions here. I want to, we're coming to the end of the hour, and I wanted to. Okay, Donnie's got a great comment here about Men in Black. He said Men in Black are just the sci-fi version of shadow people, and that's very much our point. I mean, yeah, I mean, again, the guy who shut everything down, again, terrible with names. He again,
Bertram.
the guy floated in, like, the thing that made him shut it down was the fact that it floated through the room, through his wall. Like, I'm sorry, that's not an agent of the government. I believe, don't get me wrong, I'm right there with you. Government's evil. But it's like they're not floating through your wall. They may be tapping into your phone lines or your fillings and yeah, fine, sure. But they're not floating through your walls, right?
Mm-hmm.
But shadow people do. And there's plenty of there's a lot of this stuff that just doesn't make sense. Cheese Freak, do you think they're hiding their aircraft or setting the stage for the ancient alien religion?
Hiding their aircraft, meaning like the government
Uh,
have a secret kind of
yeah,
fleet of UFOs built or something?
yeah,
I mean,
probably something along those lines.
I think let's do the first point first, I guess. Whatever we know is the technology today that we have or the Chinese or the Russians have, we're always a generation plus ahead of that in
Oh yeah.
places like Skunk Works. So,
Hmm.
is there advanced craft that your average Navy pilot is unaware of, or your average, let alone somebody like me who has no real idea anyway? Oh, they're absolutely. Well, I'm sure we're generations ahead, and I'm sure that's what a lot of these. I'm far from the only person who have said that. I'm sure that's what a lot of the Black Triangle sightings of craft have been, which have been,
Oh
for
yeah.
decades now. So, and
Mhm.
they're hiding them to the sense that, well, they don't seem to mind them being seen sometimes. They aren't rolling them out in air shows. So
Yeah.
in that way, they're hiding them. And what was the second part of the question? It was, to prepare for a fake alien invasion
Yeah,
or
well,
something?
yeah, so, yeah, essentially to sort of, again, the ancient alien things like, "Hey, look, this is the right this is the way to go because look, we have all this look, here's the Enterprise, right? And we have a bunch of Andorians coming off of it," kind of a thing.
I do think there's a plan for. Again, I hate to say disclosure because I'm not one of those people who believe there's a disclosure in the sense that everybody means when they say that word in the
Right.
community, that the US government have a
Yeah.
secret and they're going to eventually let us know. There is some plan to release certain information, whether it's true or not true. And we saw that just go into overdrive from the Tic Tac video releases in that New York Times front page story back in 2017. And we've seen it now in, hearings in Washington, and we
Mhm.
see it now. Something which is might be worth keeping an eye on is the recent supposedly UFO shot down over
Yeah.
Alaska, right? That the Pentagon do, a press briefing about. Now, I'm
Mhm.
sure that's just a Chinese drone or something, but
Right.
there was something weird about that, doing a press briefing about
Yes.
that, just strange,
Yes.
like, because the
Mhm.
UFO believers are going to see that and go, they've shot down a real UFO. So is that to
Yeah.
keep this dialogue going? I'm sure in a week's
Mhm.
time, they're not going to come out and say, yes, boys, it was another one from Zeta Reticula, and we're confirming
Mhm.
that now. That it's probably just going to be, yeah, it was Chinese. But it's interesting just to see the way this information is
The
being
language was
presented.
used. Yeah,
Yeah,
I noticed the same thing where they're like, "So it's a UFO," and they even said, "Well, we don't know what entity sent it." Like, I'm sorry, wait, what? Like, this is very specific language that's
right.
being used. I'm like,
Mhm.
you know good and darn well what you're doing with that. Like, that's not a, that's not a just, oh, we're just using, coining a term. There was a term actually I used in the book that I saw in a uh, there was a briefing that a general gave at one of some graduation. for a war college, and in his speech he talked about it, says you're going to be facing things no one else has ever faced, right? New exotic technologies, people, people who've been bioengineered, and you're like, okay, this is getting weird. He says little green men, and everyone's like, okay, does he mean aliens? Like, what is that? Now, I've come to learn that little green men are actually sort of like a code word in the military for mercenaries. Essentially, like, you can even very specifically argue governmentally backed mercenaries, right? Where it's like, yeah, the government's actually behind it, but they're off book, kind of like privateers were back in the day. So it's like the question becomes, well, did he mean that? That's the term he was using, or did he actually mean little green men, right? So it does beg that question, right? Um, so yeah, it's like you said, it's like the way they phrase this thing they just shot down was like really weird. You're like, okay, why don't you say, look, yeah, we think it probably came from China or another. It's like you didn't say that. You said, well, yeah, this looks like a spy craft from another government. You just said it was a UFO, right? Um, and use the term entity. What the heck, But again, it goes back to the premise here. The government has been doing this for a long time, actively manipulating this entire community to create ideas, and we know Hollywood's in bed with the government. This is one of those things where it's like we know that this has been going for a long time. So the fact that we had this bump in ancient astronaut theory material post 9/11, I don't think is a coincidence at all. It wasn't just everyone's like, oh, yeah, let's put it into Ice Age, a cartoon for children about the Pleistocene. Like, that makes no sense for that to be there as a joke. And yet there it is. Why? It's like there's so many changes that you see, all of a sudden all these movies and television shows blow up with this idea, and then you're like, this just feels odd for this to have been completely natural, right? So it's the whole thing feels very deliberately manipulated. Um, yeah, Jean, she says, yeah, the press conference is sleight of hand. Yeah, and that's exactly the point. This is all sleight of hand. And the problem is we don't know which hand is doing what. I think we can all agree with Donnie on this one. 1/3 of the government is evil, the other third is incompetent, the other third is evil and incompetent. I think we all agree with that. Again, yeah, so he asked supernatural means for extraterrestrial ends. Yes. I mean, again, it says on the paper. Everyone seems to ignore it. Everyone in the UFO community I see reference the paper ignores that line at the end. It's like, guys, that's for me the most important part of that entire argument, because they're saying, again, what does supernatural means mean, right? But you don't have to, you don't have to look hard to see that there's this huge occult connection with. I mean, it was very popular in the 60s to use Ouija boards to contact extraterrestrials, right?
Mhm.
Dean knows all about that.
Oh, yeah, and I think today still people are using methods to contact
Hmm.
ETs that feel ritualistic. I mean, the CE5
Hmm.
initiative,
Oh
Stephen
yeah.
Greer's group, Greer himself, he meditates and he obviously has, new age type belief system, and to go out
Hmm.
into the desert and to flash lights up into the sky and to play music. There's a ritualism to
Yeah.
this. And
Hmm.
I think we tend to forget because the mainstream ufology wanted to ignore it. But again, back to the origin days, there was a big part of the UFO community that was clearly deep into the occult. And I'm not necessarily even talking about the weird Al Benzer. I'm talking about all of the
Hmm.
contactees. So many of these people had a background, like George Adamski had a background in the occult and theosophy and things like that. Most of those
Hmm.
guys did. So much of the belief system and so much of the early days were people who had their foot in both worlds anyway. Now, what happened was there became for a period, I think, the nuts and bolts materialistic sci-fi version of ufology won out and became the dominant strain from probably, I don't know, probably even starting really in the 50s. Or there was always the occult new age channeling side of it, but the one which had the most the one which was popularized the most by science fiction, and the one that
Mhm.
your average person of the public was probably aware of, was the very nuts and bolts, they're from another star system. But that other side, the alternative way of looking at it as somehow supernatural or somehow part of a new age spirituality, never
Yeah.
went away. And I think you're right. I think we're seeing that come back far more prominently again in things like the MUFON documentary, which is a great doco. It's
Mhm.
really worth seeing. Accidental Truth, when it comes out, hasn't been released yet. And in a lot of the thinking of other people who have high profiles within the UFO community, there
Mhm.
is an idea that somehow this has a spiritual side of it, or there's something
Yep.
more than just, the extraterrestrial aspect. Even if some of these people still believe in ETs, there's a spiritualism or a
Mhm.
spirituality mixed in with it. And I think it's becoming more popular to take a position now within the mainstream, which isn't, they're just extraterrestrial nuts and bolts crafts, and it's as simple as that. So there is something happening. There's something
Yeah.
happening in the whole UFO field period. And again, the way that the new branding of UFOs by the US government and by the media, the way it's taken
Mhm.
seriously again, it hasn't been looked at that since the Condon Committee shut
Yeah.
down the reason for Project Blue Book to exist back in the late '60s. The government supposedly didn't care for all of this time, and now all of a sudden they're coming out and saying, "Well, this is worth
Now
looking
we
at."
care.
Yeah,
Yeah.
something's and that wasn't, none of this is accidental. None of this was, "Oh,
Mm-mm.
whistleblowers got the stuff out." This was all controlled release, I guarantee it.
Yeah.
It just smells like a controlled operation.
Oh,
So
exactly. Yeah. Well, and it's like, again, when 2017 they have the Tic Tac video and everything, everyone's like, "Oh," I'm like, "Guys, this is out because the government wants it out. This is a shot across the theological bow. Period. End of story." And nobody blinked. Like, that was my problem. My problem wasn't that it happened. My problem was nobody blinked about it. It's like, this is a big deal. This is much larger than you realize.
mhm,
Again, what cheesed me off is that most pastors I talk to will agree with me when I say, "Look, the ancient alien thing, this is the religion of the 21st century. This is what they're going to push. This is the new thing. This is what they want." And they all agree with me, but no one wants to talk about it at all. And people were I remember I was at a homeless shelter preaching, and I opened it up for questions. And the guy who went before me, who was with the church, I said, "Introduce me as a biblical paranormal researcher." He forgets to do that. So they're not even primed for this, right? It's like, "Hey, just, any question you want." And the very first question was about ancient astronaut theory. The very first one. And the look in his face was, "What is going on?" I answered him. I said, "Hey, I'm a biblical paranormal researcher. This is actually one of my specialties." The people, all these just homeless guys, just their eyes lit up, and they got immediate. Even the guy who ran the shelter was like, "I've never seen them this involved." And it's like, well, yeah, because people want to know about this. They care about this. Oh, I see Chloe hanging out. Hi, Chloe. Um, so yeah, it's, this is one of those things where, oh, hi. This is Chloe. This is his daughter, by the way, everyone. Um, it's a very cute doll.
she's normally very good on my shows at night, but during
Yeah.
the day, she's gotta be running around more, obviously.
Yeah. Well, she should be. She's a kid. But yeah, I mean, this is one of those things where this is clear, and again, from my position, my perspective, this is the big push. And to your point with the whole government thing, why is it that they changed it from UFO to UAP? That's my that is one of those things that for me was like, okay, you changed from unidentified flying object to unidentified aerial phenomena. That's, for me, that was very telling, because you don't change a nomenclature like that unless you again, there's an agenda behind it. This was a this to your point, I completely agree. This whole, not going to name any names per se, because I don't want to necessarily throw any shade at any one person. I don't have inside knowledge on it, but it does feel like people who've come out of the government with this information do feel this whole thing just feels very planned and very directed. Now, does that mean that they themselves are necessarily in on this being a planned release? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. Because again, studying this information for the last couple of years as I have been, one of the things I found is the person up front is usually a true believer for what is being sold to the public. Look to the person to the right. Right. It's usually the person who seems unimportant. Like with Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell was his handler. Like, he was just the asset. She was the handler. So it may be that there's other people just off to the side, and the people from the government who are now, releasing the stuff and leading the stuff, they may genuinely believe what they're saying, but that there's someone just to the right of them who are helping them along. They're the ones who know what's actually going on, and they're the ones who are sort of leading this direction. So it seems to be the way we're going.
Yeah, again, when things start being taken seriously or presented as serious, all of a
Mhm.
sudden there's some type of a agenda being played out for sure.
Yep. No, exactly. So I don't want to keep you too long. We've come to the end of the hour. And unfortunately I've got some things I need to do as well. I appreciate you coming on such late notice and taking up an hour of your Saturday. Again, we're gonna be doing more of this, guys. Not just to hang out, but Dee and I, we're gonna sit down, we're gonna do some interviews for Papers, very directed, very you know, very specific to answer questions, right? We all have, friends and loved ones and neighbors who have questions about this stuff. Siru is going to become the thing that you can say, hey, boom, here's the link. Here's the answer to this very specific question. So thank you, Dean. I really appreciate what you're doing today and what we're going to be doing in the future. You've done a lot. Just really appreciate your friendship. And again, just being another fellow Christian in this community, there ain't a lot of us, but I think it's going to end up being a lot more important. And again, having the bravery to say this stuff publicly, even though it's a very small channel, and I don't, this is a personal Bible study, but even being willing to talk about this in public, I think makes you a hero in my book. Judy, Cheese Freak, Jean, Donnie, Lisa, Bat Mom, Susan Robertson, and anyone else who I may have missed, or if you're watching on replay, we love you. We appreciate y'all hanging out with us for an hour or so. Interesting thing just actually hit across my Facebook. Rob sent me. I'm going to look into it. I may be talking about that next week. So we'll I need to do a little digging on that. So guys, here that's your thing. Dean on Siru. Rob sent me some stuff that we may be talking about next week. It's going to be interesting. So I'll see everyone tomorrow for the usual, Sunday Bible study. It's going to be great. And sorry, life's been very, very busy. So glad to be able to do this. Dean, thank you again.
Well, thanks for having me on. It's always a great joy to talk to you, and you do incredible work. So I'm happy to help in any way I can.
No, we appreciate you. All right, guys, everyone gets back to their Saturday. We appreciate y'all. Have a good one.